Hey, thanks for joining in. So in this video, we're going to be jumping into what is the meaning of porneia. It's maybe one of the most foundational issues in this whole discussion. So let's go ahead and jump in. So importantly, the other passages we looked at in previous videos, they don't deal with this word specifically, but it comes up when we begin to look at the passages in Matthew. So we see there in Matthew chapter 5, Christ is speaking. He says, "It was said, whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for porneia," which is the original Greek word, some translations say unchastity or immorality, this makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. We see this word be relevant too in another key passage for divorce and remarriage, Matthew 19:9, where it says, "And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for porneia, and marries another woman, commits adultery." So we have to begin asking, what does porneia mean? What is it doing here? So there's three interpretive options. One is that porneia only refers to incestuous unions. The second is that porneia only refers to unfaithfulness during the betrothal period. Or third, and the view that I personally have come to hold, is that porneia is a broad category referring to illegitimate sexual intercourse, and that this includes those categories above, incestuous unions and unfaithfulness during the betrothal period, but it also includes the act of adultery. So let's dig into each of these views and test them, see how legitimate they are or are not. So the first view, that porneia in this context refers to incest only, means that Christ would be saying that whoever divorces his wife, except for on the grounds of an incestuous union, makes her commit adultery, or whoever divorces his wife and marries another, except for the cases where he has entered into an incestuous union, commits adultery. So people who take this view, they'll point to 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 1, specifically, where it said, it is actually reported, so this is Paul speaking to the Corinthians, it is actually reported that there is porneia among you, and porneia of such a kind as does not exist even among the Gentiles, that someone has his father's wife. So proponents of this view will look at this passage and they'll say, see, look, so Paul is using the word porneia here specifically to refer to incest, sexual relations within one's own family. So porneia refers to incest in 1 Corinthians 5. Therefore, we should expect it to refer to incest in Matthew 5 and Matthew 19, which is a legitimate point, but let's keep digging into it. And when we do dig into it, we come across this question very quickly that will be repeated for each of these views. And that this view is saying that in Matthew 5 and Matthew 19, porneia is referring to incest and only incest. So we need to ask the question, why only? We do see in 1 Corinthians 5 that porneia can refer to incest. There's no doubt about that. But why is it the option that it can only refer to incest in these two key passages that we're looking at? And so a lot of times this position is motivated by absolute interpretations of the other passages regarding divorce and remarriage. So Mark 10, Luke 16, Romans 7, 1 Corinthians 7, they read those, or proponents of this view will often read those passages and say, hey, it looks like divorce and remarriage is prohibited absolutely. So if it's prohibited absolutely in those passages, we need to read Matthew in a way that fits with these passages. And therefore, one way to do that is saying that Jesus is only approving divorce and remarriage when the original marriage wasn't really a valid one. It was an incestuous union. It's almost like it didn't take, right? And so it's motivated, again, by absolute prohibitions in other scriptures. But for those of us who have been following along in this series, and if you haven't, I encourage you to take a look at the other videos. I've put in a lot of work to show, well, what appear like absolute prohibitions in these other passages actually are best understood to not be absolute prohibitions once we really look closely at the details of what's happening here. So that's an undercutting of the reasoning for this position. It's motivated, well, we need to say incest only in Matthew 5 and Matthew 19, because that's the only way to make it fit with these absolute prohibitions in all these other passages about divorce and remarriage. But when we see, okay, those other passages about divorce and remarriage aren't really absolute prohibitions, then that undercuts the motivation for saying it can only mean incest. The porneia can only be referring to incest in Matthew 5 and 19. So we're freed then to admit, okay, it looks like there is an example of incest, but are there other, or porneia meaning incest, but are there other examples of porneia referring to other things that should maybe broaden our scope of how we understand what it means in Matthew 5 and Matthew 19? And sure enough, there definitely is. So let's look at that. So part of this evidence arises from looking at the justification for those who believe that in Matthew 5 and Matthew 19, Christ is using the word porneia to refer exclusively to sexual infidelity that takes place during the engagement or betrothal period. And they make a pretty similar move to what we just saw previously by looking to other scriptures, seeing how the word porneia, or words closely related to the word porneia, is used there, and saying, well, if it's used this way in this passage, this must be the way it's used in the teachings of Christ in Matthew. And one key scripture that we can see as a foundation for that is in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 20 through 21 in the Septuagint, where it says, "But if this word is true, and he has not found signs of the young woman's virginity, they also shall bring the young woman on the door of her father's house, and they shall stone her with stones, and she shall die. For she did folly among the sons of Israel to fornicate, ek pornuo, while in her father's house. And you shall remove the evil one from Israel." So again, to look at this and say, hey, the word fornicate in the Greek, which is what the Septuagint is written in, is ek pornuo. So that is very clearly, just by looking at it, a word from the same family as the word for porneia, or the word porneia. And importantly, in the context of this passage, this word is referring to betrothal unfaithfulness, right? That's the test in Deuteronomy to determine if there was unfaithfulness during the betrothal period. So advocates of this view will look at this and say, hey, the root word of porneia is being used to describe betrothal unfaithfulness. Therefore, that's the meaning of the word. So when we look at that in Matthew 5 and Matthew 19, then that's the meaning that we should understand to be present there as well. And again, it's important to say, you know what, that's a fair point, right? We do see the same root word that's in the porneia word family used in Deuteronomy to be referring to betrothal unfaithfulness. But again, we need to ask the same sort of question. Why in Matthew 5 and Matthew 19 is porneia being used to refer to betrothal only, right? This view is that in Matthew 5 and Matthew 19, porneia refers exclusively to unfaithfulness during the betrothal period. So why only? Why can't it also be referring to incest, right? As we saw in 1 Corinthians 5, the word is definitely used to refer to incest there. Why can't it be incest and betrothal here? And maybe some people are willing to take a hybrid view like that. But again, it seems like a lot of times people who advocate for this view, a lot of times they don't incorporate 1 Corinthians 5 and the way porneia is used there, which is troubling. But also, again, it's largely motivated by absolute interpretations of the apparent universal prohibitions found in these other key passages that I mentioned earlier. But again, also as I mentioned earlier, we've done a lot of work to look at, well, these other passages in Mark, Luke, Romans, and 1 Corinthians, they seem to be universal prohibitions against all cases of divorce and remarriage. But when we look closer, we can see, okay, there's good reason to actually suspect something else is happening there. So once again, that undercuts the core motivation for saying that porneia refers exclusively to unfaithfulness during the betrothal period in Matthew 5 and Matthew 19. And additionally, we have the evidence from the incestuous union view. It seems like this word porneia can refer to other things besides betrothal unfaithfulness. So that's a knock against the betrothal view as well. But again, importantly, we see that porneia can refer to other things in addition to these two things. So let's keep looking at those as well. So the view that I hold is that porneia can actually refer to a broad category of types of sexual unfaithfulness, including unfaithfulness during the betrothal period, acts of incest outside of the marriage, or even if it was an incestuous union to begin with, and also two cases of adultery. And we can see this, there's a number of examples, but one key one is that this passage in the Old Testament, coming from the prophet Jeremiah, where God is speaking of the nation Israel, and he says, "And I said, after she had committed all these fornications, porneo, return to me. Yet she did not return. And faithless Judah saw her faithlessness. And therefore I saw about all the things by which I also saw, about all the things by which she was taken, by which the house of Israel had committed adultery, moikeo, and for which I had sent her away, and had given her a divorce letter into her hand. Yet faithless Judah was not afraid, and she even went and committed fornication, porneo, and her fornication, porneia, came to nothing, and she committed adultery, moikuo, with the tree and the stone." So we see there specifically that the word is used, porneia, and words of the root word family for porneia are used to describe Israel's adultery against God. It's really important too, because for some people it becomes tempting to say, well, porneia and moikeia, different words, right? So since porneia is a different word than moikeia, which is the word for adultery, porneia can't mean adultery. It's pretty reasonable process of thinking. But we see here in that passage that those words are being used almost interchangeably. Israel's porneia is being described as moikeia, right? Her fornications are being described as adultery. And so this is important too, because many times this theme comes up in the Old Testament, where God, through the prophets, is rebuking Israel for her unfaithfulness. And he uses the metaphor of Israel being a harlot. And each time that that word is used, harlot, in the Old Testament, in the Greek translation of the Old Testament called the Septuagint, the word used is porneia. We see this over and over and over again. And this is really important because God is using the word porneia to describe Israel cheating on him, breaking their marital vows to him. Therefore, we see that porneia can be used to refer to adultery. In fact, God uses it himself to describe Israel's adultery. And it's a really important parallel too, because as we read in that passage from Jeremiah 3, God does ultimately divorce Israel because of her porneia against him. So we can see then that the word porneia is used in 1 Corinthians 5 clearly to refer to incest. It's also used in the Septuagint in Deuteronomy chapter 22 to clearly refer to sexual unfaithfulness during the betrothal period. And we also see in Jeremiah chapter 3, and also in other instances in the prophets, that it is clearly used to refer to adultery during a marriage. And so it's best understood then that because we can see porneia referred to in these few ways, that porneia is a word that biblically has a broad range of meaning, and it makes the most sense then as a categorical label. We can see then that even in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul says a type of porneia, or a kind of porneia. It's used as like a general categorical label of which these other things fall into, things like incest, betrothal infidelity, and adultery after marital consummation. Each of those are examples of the category of porneia. And so when porneia is used, it is best understood to be as a categorical label. And this categorical label is broadly immoral sexual intercourse. That's what we see. That's a way to describe each of the data points we found. So when we look at Matthew 19, verse 9, reading this definition back into it, Christ says, "And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for immoral sexual intercourse, and marries another woman, commits adultery." We see in Matthew 5, also it was said, "Whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for immoral sexual intercourse, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." based on what we see from biblical data, this is the application of how it is best to understand the word porneia. It's a broad category of different types of immoral sexual intercourse. And Jesus is then saying in Matthew 19 and Matthew 5 that this type of immoral sexual intercourse is sufficient grounds for divorce and remarriage. But a lot of times people who hear this, they want to be sure to not forget about Matthew 5:32, part B, which says, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So I'll say again, this seems like another absolute prohibition. If it's adulterous to even marry a divorced woman, then it seems like even divorce on sufficient justified grounds isn't enough to actually terminate the marriage such that remarriage is genuinely permitted. That seems to be the implication from Matthew 5:32 part B. But it's concerning that looking at this verse and making it say just that is actually taking it out of context. So let's look at a parallel example here. So consider this parallel example. Suppose I said to you, whoever buys a truck, unless it's a Chevy, is an idiot. And whoever lets someone buy a truck for them is an idiot. If you heard me say that, would you think that I was saying that a person who lets someone buy them a Chevy is an idiot? If you just read the last part, the second sentence, maybe you would think so. But if you heard me say the whole thing, there's no way you would think that, right? Because I made an exception for the Chevy in the first sentence. So what would happen then is if a person is listening to this, the exception that's made in the first clause would be implied in the second clause. Or I guess those are more appropriately sentences. The exception made in the first sentence is implied in the second sentence. There's no way you would think a person who lets them buy them a Chevy is an idiot because an exception was made for the Chevy. So the same thing is happening when we look at Matthew 5:31 through 32. So whoever divorces his wife except for immoral sexual intercourse makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Just like in the parallel example, it's most reasonable to assume that the exception ought also to be implied in the second sentence. It's the most natural in the parallel example, therefore it's reasonable to conclude it's the most natural in the literal scriptural example as well. So again, just to conclude, porneia is best understood as a broad category because we see scripture using the word like a broad category. Arguments to restrict its usage ultimately fail. To try to make it say porneia only means this or only means that, it's undercut by the arguments we've made previously, but also too, it doesn't describe and doesn't fit with the biblical data. Then when we look at Matthew chapter 5 verse 32 part B, that's most naturally understood with the exception from part A to be implied. And so that doesn't undercut the claim that immoral sexual intercourse provides grounds for divorce and remarriage either. And so therefore, the best way to understand the teachings of Christ on the matter is that divorce and remarriage is permitted on the grounds of sexual immorality. But I know a lot of people who are very smart think differently than me, and above all, I just want to get to the truth on the matter. So if you see things differently, please leave a comment or reach out in some way. I would love to hear your thoughts and interact with you, see if we can get closer to truth together. Thanks, and God bless you.